one-of-a-kind combo, and they're only here on News Talk 770. Roger and Rob, Kingkade and Breakenridge. News Talk 770, Calgary's breaking news and conversation station.
Well, this next segment is one that we've kind of had on the stove, kind of bubbling away on a simmer for a little bit of time, and it's been put off, because big news has been happening. We prioritize that stuff. We finally got an opportunity here to talk about something that, regardless of which James Bond you like most, I think all James Bond fans can gather around the bonfire and have a chat about this. Who should be the next James Bond?
There's plenty to choose from. Yeah. Just like, all the nerds have their debate about who's the best Doctor Who. Or the Doctor. I don't know how it goes.
Don't look at me, dude. I'm equipped for the James Bond and the Bourne movie only.
Although the funny thing is with the Doctor Who thing is that Doctor Who is an ongoing character, and they work in each iteration that he dies and then is reborn as the next Doctor. But there's something that maybe that's what's going on with James Bond. It's kind of like that hidden plot line that James Bond keeps dying and being reborn. It's the new one.
Is it Benedict Cumberbatch, by the way, right now? Is he the guy, the Doctor Who? You know what, let's focus on Bond here. Let's get to our guest.
He could be Bond. We could throw that into the...
Oh. Well, this will be fun, okay, because let me introduce you, author and James Bond historian Bruce Scivally, who joins us on the radio now. Bruce, thanks for being here, and by the way, thanks for allowing us to put you off till today. We know we had you booked yesterday, and you've been very gracious with your time, so thank you for that.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and as a matter of fact, sorry, I've got a little bit of a cold, so you have to excuse me if I start coughing. Since I thought it was going to be on your show yesterday, I made an announcement of that on my Facebook page, which then generated some very lively comments on this whole issue of, who should be the next Bond, and should he be Idris Elba. So it gave me a little more insight into this than I would have had if I had just come on yesterday.
Oh, that's interesting and good to hear.
All right, well... Idris Elba, to me, I mean, he's British, for one thing. From what I've seen from him, he does a lot of the GQ covers and that sort of thing. He seems like a very suave, debonair gentleman. He's an accomplished actor. For all of those reasons, I don't see why he couldn't be James Bond. Do you see any reason why he couldn't be?
Well, I think for me, the things that define who a James Bond is, you want someone who's got incredible charisma and a lot of sex appeal, and I think Idris Elba has that in spades. I know Anthony Horowitz got into some trouble recently, the guy who wrote the latest James Bond novel, by saying he thought Elba was too street. But I think that's just because the portrayals he's probably seen Elba do, he's playing a more urban character. Certainly when he was on the Office here in the States, his character was a little more refined, and I think he could certainly pull off a Bond role. I mean, he's an actor. He can play whatever he's given. Just like Sean Connery was an actor who was very lower-class Scots, but was able to do the refined James Bond persona.
Yeah, I like hearing Sean Connery described that way for some reason. It is interesting, and I thought that his comment about Idris Elba being too street was really put into a poor context by a lot of people who like to be offended or find things to be upset about. Anybody who's watched Law and Order, for example, understands that the portrayal of characters in the role of, say, a police detective, for example, can take entirely different lights. You can have someone who is very gritty and thuggish, and you can have somebody who is very proper and buttoned down and into the law. And I do feel that Idris Elba's portrayal, the one that Horowitz was commenting on, was a bit more on the brusque side, if you will.
Yes, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad quality for Bond.
Right.
One of the things about James Bond, the reason the series has survived as long as it has, is the character does keep evolving. Because certainly when the first time they switched actors from Sean Connery to George Lazenby was a more vulnerable Bond than Connery was playing at that time. So everyone says it's a shame Connery didn't star in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. But I think if he had, it would have been a much more flippant movie than it ended up being. So having the new actor allowed them to explore a more vulnerable side of Bond and have a tragic ending,
Right.
Well, when you talk about grit, I mean, it seems that Daniel Craig brings that. He seems to be a grittier James Bond. Certainly, I mean, he contrasts, say, Pierce Brosnan with Daniel Craig. It comes across that way. So Daniel Craig is good enough to play James Bond and play him in kind of a gritty way. Aren't we already on that path?
Yeah, I think so. I think, to my money, certainly with Quantum of Solace, to me, it felt a little more like a Jason Bourne film than a Bond film. They kind of got back to Bond a little more with Skyfall, and I'm hoping that Spectre, the next one that's out in a couple of months, will be a little more of a traditional Bond film. But I have to realize, too, that, like I say, they keep reinventing Bond for new generations, and if they made the kind of Bond movie I want to see, which would be a little more like a Goldfinger or a Spy Who Loved Me, I don't think that kind of Bond film would connect with the younger audience they need to keep that series going. So, and that just may be me, but I feel like, they're not really making them for my generation anymore, nor should they be if they want to keep the series viable.
Right, but I think that the road you're talking about is perilous, because, I was born after Dr. No, well after Dr. No, and I guess the first Bond I ever knew was Roger Moore, so if we're going to talk about how grit is important to the casting of James Bond, I think they decided that it had absolutely no relevance whatsoever in that casting decision. But I mean, my James Bonds were Roger Moore, then Timothy Dalton, then Pierce Brosnan, and then and now Daniel Craig. And in that progression, I've seen the movies get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse until Casino Royale. I would argue that Die Another Day could have been the final bullet in the entire Bond enterprise if somebody didn't have the constitution to try to revive it.
Yeah, I think there's some good argument for that. I mean, Die Another Day, I think it was the 40th anniversary Bond. They were trying to load it with all the references to the previous films, and I think they purposely went back to a more almost cartoonish sort of plot line, and it just didn't play in 2002 the way it would in 1962, So I think it could have been the nail in the coffin there. And I agree with you, Casino Royale to me is like the best Bond movie of the past 20 years, probably.
But is it because in the portrayal of James Bond there, they really got more to the kind of character that Ian Fleming had in mind?
Well, I think that was part of it. I mean, again, they have a new actor in the role. They're able to introduce some new elements into it, and it is a little more Fleming-esque than Pierce Brosnan was allowed to play. I mean, Brosnan wanted to do that kind of grittier Bond, but the scripts he was given weren't of that ilk. And Timothy Dalton was that kind of Bond, but unfortunately, I think the director in the scripts he had kind of hampered him. Mm-hmm. But he certainly was a much tougher Bond than Roger Moore was, no doubt about it.
Funny, I read a parody article on the web that said that Daniel Craig was in talks to star as the first white Shaft. Right? And it's sort of playing on this racial angle. I mean, if you're going to remake Shaft, I don't think you would cast a white actor, but maybe that's more specific to that movie and that character. Idris Elba is black, and I know some people read Street as kind of code for black. Let's assume that it's not. There have been people who say, well, no, not to be racist, but maybe James Bond should be white. Maybe James Bond is white. Is there any reason why James Bond can't be black?
Well, I mean, certainly the dialogue I've had on my Facebook page, there are some, hardcore Bond fans, black and white, who feel that, Fleming described the character as being white, as looking rather like Hoagie Carmichael and so on, which certainly Daniel Craig doesn't, Mm-hmm. But I think, if you're going to hew to the creator's vision of it, then yes, he should be white. On the other hand, I think, again, if the series is not trying so hard to adhere to those original novels, which obviously if you read the novels, the plot lines for the films are very different for the most part, because they would be very dated if they stuck to the 1950s plot lines. But I think if you're going to update the character, for me, I see no reason why he couldn't be black. The main thing is, he just has to be kind of an upper class snob who, goes to exotic places, interacts with beautiful women, has all the fun gadgets and a lot of action. Some of the people commenting on my Facebook page say, well, sure, they wouldn't mind seeing a film like that with a black actor, but why call him 007 then? Why not make him 008 or 009?
Right, yeah.
But, it's kind of like, some say, well, you wouldn't have a black actor playing Sherlock Holmes. Again, I don't see, if it's a modern-day Sherlock Holmes, why that would even be an issue, Well,
interesting example, because in the American spin-off of Sherlock Holmes, a program I believe is called Elementary, Watson is not only female, but is an Asian female.
Yes, exactly.
Well, and you have the Fantastic Four movie that bombed this summer, but there was some controversy with the fact that they made one of the characters, the Human Torch, black, and there was a character in the comic books who had always been white.
Yeah, and an interesting comment someone had on my Facebook page was that with the Avengers movies, where the character of Nick Fury is played by Samuel L. Jackson.
Yeah, well, that too, yeah.
It's like he was always a white character in the comic books. Now he's been played by Samuel L. Jackson. And would audiences ever again accept a white actor playing that role? Once we've had Samuel L. Jackson, so they said if you go that way with Bond and have a black actor play Bond, would audiences then want to take a step back and have a white actor do it?
That's a fair question, yeah.
So, sorry, continue. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, I think it's it is an interesting question to ask. On the other hand, I kind of feel like this whole controversy is really just a kind of a tempest in a tea kettle, because what happens anytime a Bond movie comes out, the press starts speculating who will be the next James Bond, because it just makes for interesting copy for people to read or things to report on in the news, and they can do their polls of who do you think should be James Bond. And they did these in the 1990s, and some of the people responding then said, Denzel Washington would make a good Bond, and someone even posited, Sharon Stone as a female Bond,
Okay.
So you get all kinds of names thrown out there, and I think that's more or less, what happened in this instance. For that matter, in the later on in the 90s, when Pierce Brosnan was playing Bond, he was asked, who do you think the next Bond should be? And he said Colin Salmon, who was a black actor who played Charles Robinson in the films that Brosnan was in. But I think Brosnan had a little insider info most people didn't, which is that Colin Salmon, when they would screen test actresses to be Bond women, he often played Bond in those screen tests.
Oh, wow.
So this idea of a black actor playing Bond, it's not necessarily a new concept. This has come up pretty much every time there's a new Bond film coming out, and people start all this speculation.
But I'm glad you brought up. I'm glad you brought up Denzel Washington in that argument, though, because obviously an accomplished actor and suave and debonair and everything that Bond has. But above being black, he's American, and I think that right there should be all three strikes. You can't have an American James Bond. At least I would have a difficult time watching an American James Bond. And so, to that point, I kind of wonder if this bridge hasn't already been crossed a long time ago. James Bond, as we learn in Skyfall, is Scottish, or if we've read the books, he's a Scot. And the first Bond...
Yeah, actually, he was made Scottish after Connery played the role.
Okay, so
because once Connery was cast, the next novel Fleming wrote was on Her Majesty's Secret Service, where he gave Bond the Scottish background to kind of match Sean Connery.
Right, and oddly enough, that's when they chose to cast an Aussie in the role of James Bond to follow him up. To follow him up with an Englishman, Roger Moore, who was then followed by a Welshman, Timothy Dalton, who was followed by an Irishman, Pierce Brosnan. So I would suggest that at least in Britain, this battle's already been fought and won or lost.
Well, even beyond that, and by the way, Timothy Dalton would argue that he is not Welsh. His parents were English, so he's an Englishman. But even though he was born in Wales, he's not Welsh. When they were making Diamonds Are Forever and looking for someone to... Actually, when they made him on Her Majesty's Secret Service, before they hired Lazenby, they offered the role to Adam West, if you can believe that.
No kidding.
Really?
Who turned it down because he felt Bond should be British. And when they were making Diamonds Are Forever, the next film, realizing they didn't want to use Lazenby again, one of the names that Guy Hamilton, the director, bandied about as a potential Bond was Burt Reynolds. Because he had seen Burt Reynolds on TV and thought he had the right persona for it.
Burt could have used a boost.
And John Gavin, who was in Psycho, Hitchcock Psycho, who's actually a Hispanic actor, was signed to play Bond in Diamonds Are Forever, but dropped out when they then re-signed Sean Connery. So they have, and for that matter, when they made Octopussy, and were in contract negotiations with Roger Moore, they actually hired James Brolin to play Bond. So he was in England. He said, I was there with Cubby. I was looking for places to live. I was going to the tailors. And about 2 weeks before the movie started shooting, they came to terms with Roger Moore because I think the thinking was they didn't want to introduce a new James Bond up against Sean Connery, who was doing a rival Bond film for another producer. So
fascinating. Well, Bruce, stand by if you can here. We'll take a quick break and we'll come back and continue this conversation. Bruce Scivally is our guest. He's an author and James Bond historian. His book, James Bond, The Legacy. We're back with more right after this. talking about James Bond, the ongoing debate about who should be the next James Bond, whether Idris Elba is a suitable candidate, all of these questions. Bruce Scivally is an author and a James Bond historian. I wonder, Bruce, if this is a perpetual debate, or we'll ever get to a point in which we say, is this guy the last James Bond?
Well, I have to say, again, the producers have been very good at reinventing the character every so often. I gave a quote when Daniel Craig was hired. I thought, when he was first cast, I thought, my God, he looks like some, soccer thug. He's not quite my conception of Bond. But I thought he was fabulous in Casino Royale, so he sold me. But, I feel like every so often they reinvent Bond just like Madonna to keep him fresh for a new generation, But I think, again, there's always going to be this thing. Every time a movie comes out, everyone starts speculating who else could play the role. And it often has absolutely nothing to do with reality. These people haven't been approached or not in contention. And even though Daniel Craig said recently this may be his last, that's kind of a common ploy of the Bond actors, too. After they've done a few, they make one and say, well, this is my last one, because then it puts them in a better position to negotiate a higher salary for the next one.
I like that. So I always thought a more important question is who's going to write the next Bond movie, particularly after the Brosnan era, when I thought that the movie, the scripts were just terrible. I mean, I still love Bond. You still love going to the Bond movies, and nothing was going to keep me from seeing Die Another Day. But man, brother, those were bad flicks.
Well, Die Another Day had some issues, definitely. I mean, I always wonder what happened to all those people who came to see Gustav Graves' demonstration of his satellite beam, who just totally disappear after a certain point. You don't know how they got off that ice floor or whatever. So there were some problems with that film. But I do think too, one of the worst jobs in the world has to be writing the next James Bond movie, because after 20 some odd movies, it's like, how do you make this new and fresh and not seem like a tired retread? So it's one of those jobs that as a writer, I'd love to have. But I'd be scared to death to have it, too.
Right.
It's funny, I was saying, because I saw Skyfall. I didn't see many Bond films. I did see that one, and it almost kind of reminded me in a way of the Dark Knight movie. You also wrote a book about Batman, and when you look at it, I think there have been like 7 actors, including Adam West, who have played Batman, and there's always such a debate about who's going to be the next Batman, who's the right fit for Batman. Do you see a lot of parallels there?
Well, absolutely. I mean, they're both sort of, high-profile characters, and it's one of these things that's, it's just a question that makes good copy for newspapers and radio interviews and so on, because it's the kind of thing that everyone's going to have an opinion on, So it's just kind of a hot-button issue. Who do you think should be James Bond,
Well, that's actually the next question, then. Who do you think should be the next James Bond, and who's out there besides Idris Elba?
Well, this is the thing. I think Daniel Craig will probably come back and do at least one more. I think whoever the next one's going to be, like Daniel Craig, is probably someone we are not even aware of yet, but the casting people have their eye on. Because certainly before Craig got it, no one would have ever predicted him as the next Bond.
Well, we had to be introduced to him, right? And remember there was that controversy, he can't drive a standard, he couldn't drive a stick shift, and all this stuff. So it's true, like, that you hear the announcement, and then the next question is, I'm sorry, who?
Yeah, my co-author, John Cork, had an interesting observation at one point, and this didn't really apply to Craig, but he felt that one of the key things in hiring someone to play Bond is to get someone who has played a Bond-like character before. Roger Moore had been the same. Pierce Brosnan had been Remington Steele, So they were people that audiences had already seen in a kind of spy persona. For that matter, Daniel Craig had done a sort of action film with layer cake, tough, gritty action film. So.
Well, we'll see who it shall be. But
Henry Cavill was being talked about when they were casting for Daniel Craig as being a potential Bond, but of course now he's Superman and just made Man from U.N.C.L.E., which didn't do quite so well at the box office. So I just saw the other day that the odds makers are putting their money now on Tom Hardy to be the next Bond. So again, all these sort of high-profile actors, their names get bandied about, but it's going to be 2 or 3 years before the next film is made, and by that time there may be some other young actor who's come along who would be ideal for it.
All right, well, it's been a fun conversation, Bruce. Thanks so much for being here this morning.
Well, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Good stuff. We'll talk to you again maybe when Spectre comes out. Maybe we'll get a review out of you.
That sounds great.
All right, take care, sir. That is Bruce Scivally, author and James Bond historian. about Idris Elba. Is the world ready for a black James Bond? I think the world is just ready for good James Bond movies, regardless.
See, to me, and I keep beating this drum, I see a lot of parallels. If they would cast a black actor, say instead of Ben Affleck, to be the new Batman, or they were considering a black actor to play Batman, you'd see the same kind of reaction, the same kind of debate. I think in a lot of ways Bruce Wayne is the American James Bond.
Sure.
So I see that same kind of attachment in some ways to the characters. So I don't know, because people have their own idea of what it should be and what it should represent. And when you say the name, when you say James Bond or Batman or Superman or some of these characters, you get an immediate image in your head of what that character is. And if they say, again, and they bring out this person who looks nothing like what you have in your head, there's a disconnect. And because people love these characters so much, there's a strong reaction.
Yeah, people had a problem with Daniel Craig being blonde, too. That James Bond has brown hair, always has had brown hair, so you can't have a blonde James Bond. But we got over that, and here we are. We love Daniel Craig as James Bond. Many of us do, anyway. The thing about James Bond, though, is that he's never had to be white. Like, we got this funny comment. Somebody texted in to say, what's next? A Japanese actor portraying General MacArthur. And I get the joke. And you know,
that's a real person.
Yeah. And so you basically be like, you couldn't cast a white guy as Muhammad Ali. Like, Muhammad Ali has to be black. It doesn't have to be Will Smith, but you're not going to put a white guy in that role and all of a sudden the racial issues of the 1950s are going to be portrayed properly.
They didn't need a disabled person to play Stephen Hawking, did they?
Good point.
Aha. Checkmate. No, but
do you know what I'm saying? Though, like,
these are real people.
Yes.
You can't compare fictional people with real people.
Okay, and fair enough. But there's nothing about James Bond, though, that has to be white. He really could be of any race, particularly somebody who comes from a cosmopolitan society that is Great Britain today.
Right. Yeah. I don't see why not. Especially if you know the new iteration of Bond coming from a more humble background might even lend itself more to that.
Yeah, and to the same point about Batman, I mean, Gotham is a fictitious place entirely. There's nothing that suggests he couldn't be a black guy. Bruce Wayne. Right. We'll wait and see, though. We'll wait and see. And by the way, we will follow this story closely. When we come back from the news to 11:30, we're going to talk to Don Norman, who's a professor and director at Design Lab at the University of California, San Diego. We're going to talk about autonomous vehicles, the Google car. This is Kingkade and Breakenridge on News Talk 770.